Arnhem, the Netherlands. At the northern end of the road bridge over the Lower Rhine, a small British airborne force was already cut off, short of ammunition, and surrounded by German troops who were growing stronger by the hour. The men of the 1st Airborne Division had landed 2 days earlier as part of Operation Market Garden, a bold Allied attempt to seize a chain of bridges and open a fast road into Germany. On paper, the plan was simple. Paratroopers would capture the crossings. British armor would race up the corridor. The war might be shortened before winter, but Arnhem was not behaving like paper. The British had expected to hold the bridge for 2 or 3 days. Instead, German resistance hardened almost immediately. Elements of German armored and SS formations were in the area, faster and stronger than Allied intelligence had judged. The road to Arnhem became blocked. Reinforcements were delayed. Radios failed. Units landed miles from their objectives. By the time Lieutenant Colonel John Frost's men reached the bridge, they were already isolated. Among them was Major Digby Tatham-Warter, an officer from a company, 2nd Battalion, Parachute Regiment. He became famous for his unusual battlefield appearance. A bowler hat, a rolled umbrella, and an almost theatrical calm under fire. Yet beneath that eccentric image was a serious airborne officer trying to hold a position that was becoming impossible. The Germans understood the situation. They had numbers, armor, artillery, and time. The British had courage, discipline, and a shrinking perimeter of shattered buildings. From the German point of view, surrender was not only logical. It was inevitable. So when German attempts were made to discuss British surrender, the moment carried more than military meaning. It was a test of nerve. The British were surrounded. They were outgunned. Their rescue column had not arrived. Their wounded were increasing. Every hour made their position worse. But at Arnhem, surrender was not simply a command decision. It was also a question of morale. If the men believed the end had already come, the bridge would fall sooner. If they believed they could still hold, even for a few more hours, then everything around them could change. And that is exactly why one British officer's response became part of Arnhem legend. The plan behind Arnhem had been designed for speed. Operation Market Garden was meant to bypass the main German defenses of the Siegfried Line by driving north through the Netherlands, using airborne troops to seize bridges ahead of British 30 Corps. If the furthest bridge at Arnhem could be held, the road into northern Germany and the Ruhr would be opened. It was ambitious, fast, and dependent on every part moving almost perfectly. On September 17, 1944, British paratroopers of the 1st Airborne Division flew toward Arnhem in American transport aircraft. Their task was the hardest in the entire operation. American airborne divisions would secure crossings farther south, while the British and Polish airborne forces were assigned the most distant objective, the bridge over the Lower Rhine at Arnhem. The distance mattered. Every mile between the paratroopers and 30 Corps gave the Germans more time to react. The first problem appeared before the battle had even properly begun. Many British landing zones were several miles from the bridge. The airborne troops were lightly armed, because parachute and glider forces could not carry the heavy weapons of an armored division. Against infantry, they could fight with skill and aggression. Against tanks and self-propelled guns, their options were limited. The National Army Museum notes that the British airborne troops had only a few anti-tank guns and artillery pieces adapted for glider transport, while German armored elements in the area had not been properly detected by Allied intelligence. Lieutenant Colonel John Frost's 2nd Parachute Battalion did what history would remember most clearly. It reached the northern end of Arnhem Bridge and established a defensive position among the buildings near the approach road. But most of the division did not reach him. Other British units were blocked, delayed, or pushed into a shrinking pocket west of the town around Oosterbeek. Arnhem had become 2 battles at once. Frost's isolated stand at the bridge, and the wider struggle of the division trying to survive long enough for relief. Among them was Major Tatham-Warter and the men near the bridge, and that meant every hour made their position more exposed. German pressure increased. The road behind them was not secure. The relief column had not arrived. What had begun as a bridge seizure was becoming a siege, and the Germans were already preparing to make the British understand it. By the morning of September 19th, The bridge position had become a battlefield of ruins, smoke, and narrow fields of fire. Frost's men had stopped a German armored thrust from the southern side of the river, including elements of the reconnaissance units of the 9th SS Panzer Division. The attack had been broken by concentrated small arms fire, grenades, and PIAT anti-tank weapons. But the success did not solve the larger problem. It only proved that the British could still hurt the Germans, even while surrounded. Inside the British perimeter, the defenders occupied houses near the northern ramp of the bridge. Windows became firing points. Cellars became aid posts. Streets became killing zones. The Germans could see that the British were isolated, and they began to reduce the position methodically. Tanks and self-propelled guns fired into buildings at close range. Mortars and artillery broke roofs, walls, and staircases. The defenders had no secure supply line, and the expected ground relief from 30 Corps was still far to the south. IWM records note that Frost's men had limited water, rations, and ammunition, while German reinforcements were moving toward Arnhem with heavier weapons. This was the moment where the difference between courage and endurance became clear. Courage had taken the British to the bridge. Endurance now had to keep them there. Men who had jumped into the Netherlands with the expectation of a fast link-up were now trapped inside collapsing houses, holding out against an enemy who could rotate troops, bring up armor, and tighten the ring. Tatham-Warter's reputation grew in this atmosphere because his behavior seemed almost impossible to reconcile with the danger around him. He moved through the position with a calmness that steadied other men. His umbrella and unusual appearance later became legendary. But the deeper point was not eccentricity. It was control. In a battle where radios failed, units became separated, and German pressure increased hour by hour, visible steadiness mattered. By then, the German logic was obvious. The British bridge force was surrounded. Its ammunition was running down. Its wounded were increasing. Relief had not arrived. From a purely military calculation, surrender appeared only a matter of time. But the men at Arnhem were not fighting for comfort or escape. They were fighting to buy time for the whole operation. And the longer they held, the more the Germans had to commit against them. The attempt to break British will did not come only through shells and armor. German commanders also understood the psychological shape of the battle. A surrounded enemy could sometimes be destroyed faster by convincing him that further resistance was useless. At Arnhem, German surrender approaches were made against men who were already short of food, water, ammunition, and medical supplies. The British position near the bridge had no realistic route of escape, and the broader division at Oosterbeek was also being compressed into a defensive pocket. The Imperial War Museum describes how the operation failed to achieve the rapid link-up on which the Airborne plan depended, leaving the British isolated north of the Rhine. This is where the legend around Major Tatham-Warter must be handled carefully. Later retellings made his defiance sound almost theatrical, because he was remembered for carrying an umbrella and refusing to behave as if defeat was inevitable. Some accounts describe German surrender suggestions receiving a sharp British response, with Tatham-Warter's umbrella becoming a symbol of defiance. But the important historical truth is not a single perfect line of dialogue. The important truth is that British officers at Arnhem refused to let German pressure turn isolation into collapse. For the men defending the bridge, surrender would have been understandable. They had fulfilled their orders as far as conditions allowed. They had reached the bridge. They had blocked German movement. They had held far longer than lightly armed airborne troops were expected to hold against tanks and artillery. Yet the reason they continued was simple: time. Every hour they kept German forces fixed at Arnhem was an hour those forces could not be used elsewhere along the corridor. Every ruined house became part of the wider Allied gamble. Tatham-Warter's calmness mattered because soldiers read their officers under pressure. Panic travels quickly in a surrounded force. So does confidence. An officer who moved deliberately through danger, who remained recognizable to his men, and who treated German demands as something to be resisted rather than feared, helped preserve the fighting spirit of the position. The Germans wanted the British to understand that the bridge was lost. The British understood something different. Even if Arnhem could not be won in the way planners had imagined, the stand itself still had military value. It delayed, disrupted, and forced the Germans to pay for ground they believed should already have been theirs. And as the bridge perimeter tightened, the battle changed from an operation of movement into a test of how long men could endure inside fire and stone. By September 20th, the British force at the bridge was no longer holding a neat defensive line. It was holding fragments. Buildings that had served as strong points were burning or collapsing. Smoke-filled rooms where wounded men waited for treatment. German armor fired into houses from close range, while infantry worked forward through side streets and ruined gardens. Frost himself was wounded, and command became increasingly difficult as communications failed and positions were cut apart from one another. The National Army Museum notes that the British airborne troops at Arnhem were eventually overwhelmed after being isolated from the rest of the Allied advance, while the wider operation failed to secure the final Rhine crossing. This was the stage where the famous surrender theme became most powerful. The Germans did not need to imagine British weakness. They could see the facts. The bridge force was short of ammunition. Medical supplies were nearly exhausted. Water was scarce. Many buildings were on fire. The defenders could still shoot, but they could no longer restore the battle to its original plan. What they could do was deny the Germans an easy victory. For Tatham-Warter, that denial was expressed through visible steadiness. The stories of his umbrella and bowler hat survived because they captured something real about airborne morale at Arnhem. Whether every later detail was polished by memory or cinema, the deeper truth remains clear. He represented the refusal to let German pressure decide British behavior. He was not pretending the danger was small. He was showing his men that fear did not have to control the next decision. At the same time, the fight at the bridge was no longer the only crisis. West of Arnhem, Major General Roy Urquhart's 1st Airborne Division was being forced back into a defensive perimeter around Oosterbeek. The planned link-up with 30 Corps had been delayed by German resistance along the narrow road corridor, especially farther south around Nijmegen. The Imperial War Museums explains that the whole market garden concept depended on airborne troops securing bridges while 30 Corps advanced rapidly along the corridor toward Arnhem. Once that movement slowed, Frost's men at the bridge became dangerously exposed. So the German demand for surrender was not just aimed at one officer or one building. It was aimed at the entire idea that airborne troops could still influence the battle after being cut off. The British answer came not through speeches, but through continued resistance. Every extra hour forced German commanders to spend more men, more vehicles, and more time against a force they had expected to crush. By the night of September 20th and into September 21st, the defense at the bridge could no longer be sustained as a fighting position in any meaningful sense. The British had held far beyond the original expectation, but the cost had become severe. Frost's small force had been reduced by casualties, fire, exhaustion, and the simple mathematics of ammunition. The rest of the 1st Airborne Division remained trapped around Oosterbeek, while the final bridge over the Rhine had not been secured for the Allied advance. The Imperial War Museums records that Market Garden's purpose was to open a corridor into Germany by taking the bridges, with Arnhem as the furthest and most decisive crossing. When the bridge position finally collapsed, it did not collapse because the Germans had broken British nerve. It collapsed because isolated airborne troops, lightly equipped and cut off from relief, had reached the limit of what men and weapons could physically do. The National Army Museum describes the wider Arnhem failure as the result of distance, German resistance, and the inability of 30 Corps to reach the airborne troops in time. That is why the surrender story still carries weight. It was not about a magical reversal or a single officer winning the battle alone. It was about defiance under conditions where surrender looked logical, even inevitable. Major Tatham-Warter and the men around him became symbols of that attitude. Surrounded, outgunned, and still unwilling to let the enemy decide the meaning of their stand. Arnhem did not give the Allies the road into Germany, but it gave history one of the clearest examples of airborne endurance in the Second World War. The Germans told British officers to surrender. What changed was not the battlefield result, but the cost, the memory, and the legend of men who held until holding was no longer possible. If you found this story powerful, hit the like button, subscribe, and tell us in the comments which forgotten World War II stand we should cover next.